Welcome to the Rap Soul Podcast, where we dive deep into the world of music that moves our hearts and gets our feet tapping. This is the intersection of rap and soul music from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. We appreciate you for listening. Share this podcast with a friend or family member who loves music as much as you do. The podcast is hosted by 12 Kyle. Next up, the Rap Soul Podcast.
What's up, y'all? It's your boy 12 Kyle from the Rap Soul Podcast. I want to thank each and every one of you for tuning in as you do each and every week. I really do appreciate it. I also wanted to offer a programming note. This particular episode, the Rap Soul Podcast Classic, is an old episode. And for some, it may have been something that they've heard before because it was initially on the flagship station, the 12 Kyle Podcast, back in 2016. But I wanted to give it to you guys here because the thing is that many of you didn't know my podcast existed in 2016. And the great thing about these episodes is that the information has not changed. It's not dated, and it's going to sound and feel as fresh as it did back then. So sit back and relax and check out this new episode from the Rap Soul Podcast Classic. I appreciate it. 5,000. Yo. Thanks again for checking out another edition of the 12 Kyle Podcast. I'm 12 Kyle, but you should know that by now. If you haven't done so already, make sure that you subscribe to the podcast. You can find the podcast anywhere. We're on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, SoundCloud, Google Play, Overcast FM, Pocket Cast, YouTube. Of course, you can catch me on Facebook, Twitter, and the Gram. So there's no reason not to subscribe to this podcast. All right. So here's what we're going to talk about today. As many of you know, if you've been following this podcast, we've been featuring a lot of albums, a lot of great hip hop albums that dropped in 1996. And this podcast will be no different. We're going to talk about the fourth album from A Tribe Called Quest, Beats, Rhymes, and Life. This was their fourth album, and it dropped on July 30th, 1996. Man, it's hard to believe it's been 20 years because I remember, how things were when I actually copped this album. Much anticipated. Anybody knows me knows that I'm a huge Tribe Called Quest fan. So I was definitely looking forward to this album. And, you have to kind of also look when you look at and you think about this album, you also have to look at the backdrop of what was going on at this particular time in the summer of 1996. Just to give you an idea, earlier that year, the Fugees dropped The Score. Tupac dropped All Eyes on Me. Just the month prior to this album coming out, Jay-Z dropped Reasonable Doubt. Nas came with It Was Written. And Native Tongue crew members, De La Soul just dropped Stakes Is High just a couple of weeks prior to this one. So you have all of that coupled with the fact that there is a East Coast, West Coast beef, quote unquote, brewing in this country. And here comes Tribe Called Quest. So no pressure, right? Not to mention that it's been 3 years since the previous album, Midnight Marauders, which personally is my favorite Tribe Called Quest album, right? So you got all of that going on. And so, there is some pressure for them to deliver. Just to give you an idea, man, it was A Tribe Called Quest. This album was highly anticipated because you just didn't know what they were going to do. Anytime you have success, it's always met with, the question of, can you do it again? And A Tribe Called Quest came out the gates with their first album, People's Instinctive Life. People's Instinctive, man, is in many circles, a classic. Then they follow that up with Low End Theory, another hip hop classic. Then they follow that one up with Midnight Marauders, which personally I think is a classic. A lot of people don't think it's a classic, but it's right there. You ask 10 people, you may get 5 say it's a classic. You may have 5 say it's not a classic, but it's a dope album, right? So you have that, and then they have this history. At this particular time, Fife was starting to do his own little thing on the side. You saw him kind of rhyming with other people and stuff like that, freestyles and stuff like that on other tracks. Ali Shaheed Muhammad was getting into the production side. Both he and Q-Tip, they were working with acts like D'Angelo and Roots, and so you had this whole movement. And I remember coming up to this album, I was interested to see who was going to do the production on the album. And I got wind, and this, of course, is the pre-internet era, so you had to, it was by word of mouth, that the production was going to be from the Ummah. And I'm like, okay, who the hell is Ummah? The Ummah was a group that consisted of Q-Tip, Ali Shaheed Muhammad, and Jay Dilla, the great Jay Dilla, rest in peace, from Slum Village. So, and at the time, honestly, I didn't know much about Jay Dilla. So I was... that's the only kind of information, if you will, that I had leading up to this album. So again, you got everything else is going around. You may have a situation where the production has changed slightly and it's different, because just to give you an idea, other than the Ummah produced the entire album with the exception of one song, and that was produced by Rashad Smith. But other than that, the Ummah group, they produced the entire album. So you had a possibility that Tribe would be coming with maybe a little bit less of the jazz kind of sound that they had on the previous albums. But come on, man, this is Tribe. It's going to be funky. If nothing else, it's going to be funky. It's going to be dope. And you're going to get dope rhymes from Fife, and you're going to get dope rhymes from Q-Tip, and it's going to be all love, right? So that's what we anticipated going in. This album did well commercially. I think the first single was Once Again. And so when I remember the first time I heard Once Again, I was like, okay, like this is, I'm vibing to it. Got the chick singing on the hook. I'm like, okay, so this is the jam. This is, this is bumping. This is going to be okay. Right. So that was the first single, but this album sold well. This album eventually sold. It went platinum. I want to say it dropped in 1996. I want to say by the end of 96, it was at least certified gold. It went platinum in 1998. But to be honest, even though the success that the album had, and I mean, it was nominated for a Grammy, and in 1997, and Tribe was nominated for a Grammy for Best Rap Duo Performance. So it's it was well received, to say the least. I think it got 4 mics in the source. Rolling Stone and some of these other magazines, they liked it. It wasn't really anybody, from when it comes to critics, there were no critics necessarily dumping on the album per se. So it was, it was a good look. It was a good look, or so we thought. But the album, I think, really, really was different. It was different from what we had heard prior to. So let me just break down the tracks for you. First, the album starts off with Phony Rappers. Now, here's the thing that was really interesting, because I remember listening to Phony Rappers for the first time, and I hear, Q-Tip rhyming or whatever, and then I hear this other voice, and I'm like, who the hell is that? Because it wasn't Fife. And I'm like, oh snap, is Ali Shaheed Muhammad rapping? And I looked on the liner notes, and it was somebody named by the name of Consequence. I'm like, okay, who the hell is Consequence? And at that particular time, I looked at the rest of the liner notes without even finishing the album. And I looked up, and I'm like, damn, this dude Consequence. And keep in mind, I'd never heard of Consequence before. He's on. There's 15 tracks. He's on half the album. How the hell does that happen? So I was like, okay, and I'm reading this as I'm listening to the first track, and he was okay, but I'm like, okay, how is this dude on all of these tracks? And I was like, okay, well, I'm still gonna listen. It's no big deal. So Phony Rappers comes on. It's it's tight. Get a Hold comes on. The beat is banging. I'm like, okay, I like this. After that, you got Motivators. Consequences on that again. Then you get the Jam. Then you got The Crew, which is kind of I actually like Crew. Actually, I like a lot of songs, but Crew is real mellow out. It's kind of like an interlude or what have you. The Mind Power, the Hop, and so I'm like, okay, this is different. This is different. I'm sorry. Let me back up. It went from Get a Hold to Motivators. Then it went to Jam, then Crew, then The Pressure, and then Once Again, which was the lead single. Now I love Once Again, man. Once Again. Tammy Lucas on the hook. It was the lead single. That song I think really could have fit on. It could have been on Midnight Marauders. I thought it was really dope. Like I said, she's on the hook, and it had a cool video, and I was like, okay, this is this. When I heard it for the first time, I was like, okay, this is vintage Tribe. Everything else, from Get a Hold to Motivators, Jam, Crew, and The Pressure, didn't necessarily sound. It wasn't whack, but it didn't sound like something that we had heard on previous Tribe albums. Then it went to Mind Power, The Hop, and then Keep It Moving. Keep It Moving. I like Keep It Moving. I liked it a lot. One of the things that was interesting, and I mentioned earlier, we did have a East Coast, West Coast, quote unquote, beef going on, in hip hop. And what was interesting was in the albums that dropped that particular year, you didn't really have too many people address it, particularly like Nas didn't address it on It Was Written. Jay-Z didn't address it on Reasonable Doubt. But there was, I want to say there was a song by Westside Connection that gave some reference to A Tribe Called Quest, and it was like, took it as a diss or whatever like that. So my man Q-Tip comes back and he addresses it on Keep It Moving. Hey, what can you say? He addressed it. I mean, like, he wasn't necessarily coming after them or coming after anybody, but I think Tribe did a good job as far as staying neutral in this quote unquote beef. A lot of groups did. It really wasn't, and I wish I had time to talk about how manufactured I think the East Coast West Coast beef was. Maybe I'll save that for another podcast. But yeah, it was, so I'm glad that he addressed it. But again, the album is moving along and it sounds pretty good or whatever. After Keep It Moving, you got Baby Fife's return, which, he's rhyming on the Consequences on the hook. This was the only song where Fife is featured by himself, and he really wasn't even featured by himself because Consequences on the hook. And I'll talk about that in a second. And I remember when I was looking at the liner notes, I'm like, Baby Fife's return. Okay, Fife's gonna spaz on it. Like, I was waiting for Fife to really go in. Next up is Separate Together. Then What Really Goes On, Wordplay, and then the album ends with Stressed Out with Faith Evans on the hook. Love Stressed Out. It really, I think Stressed Out is a song that I think a lot of people could vibe to just based on what they're talking about and how they're actually feeling. So that was the second single to be released. I think that was released back in like November of '96. So like I said, the album did well. The tracks were good. I'm not going to front on it, and I'll give you my opinion on the album in its entirety in just a second. But I think after the first couple of listens, I just realized that Tribe was moving in a different direction, and they weren't necessarily moving in the same direction. And I didn't really get that the first time I heard it, but as I got, as this album got older, and then obviously we saw the great documentary by Michael Rappaport, of the same name, Beeps Rhymes Life, which showed how, and maybe a little bit why Tribe went through this internal strife within a group, and which ultimately led to them making the Love Movement album, which was their last album. Nonetheless, man, it was, after the first couple of listens, I just realized that Tribe was in a different place. And, I had to kind of come to grips with that it wasn't a signature Tribe sound. But, I had the stuff that I liked. I had the stuff that I didn't like. So I think that was kind of key as well. I tell you what, let's take a quick commercial break. Let's get an interview from A Tribe Called Quest. And on the other side, I'll break down what I liked, what I didn't like about this album, and where it fits in history. I'll be back in just a sec.
Okay. Now, through all of this stuff, man, Tribe Called Quest has managed to stay together. It's the fourth time around. You all have done what a lot of groups can't do, and that's stick together. We see people come and go, especially in hip-hop, like this and like that. Despite the fact that you've done different things, and you've done different things, and you've done different things, how is it that the unit stays together?
Through love, you know what I'm saying? Allah has a plan, you know what I'm saying? Allah's plan, people plot and plan and they scheme, but surely Allah's plan is the greatest, because Allah is the best of planners. So that's all we could credit it to, and we could credit it to the fact that, we have a sincere love for the music, and we have a sincere love and admiration for each other. So.
If you want a podcast where culture, conversation, and life collide, where you get insightful commentary, engaging discussions, and a fresh perspective on everything, then you need to listen to the 12 Kyle podcast. Hosted by the one and only, yours truly, 12 Kyle, a voice that you know and trust. This podcast will bring you thought-provoking moments, compelling stories, and a whole lot of fun. Whether you're a first-time listener or just tuning in, each episode promises to be something new and exciting. So sit back, relax, join 12 Kyle, myself, and my guests as we break down the world around us and give you stories that you've never heard before, from nostalgic throwbacks to everything in between. The 12 Kyle podcast is a front row seat to this conversation. Subscribe now and never miss an episode of the 12 Kyle podcast, where the vibe is always real and the discussion is always worth your time. Are you feeling nostalgic for the golden eras of rap and soul music? If so, tune in to the Rap Soul Podcast. We are your weekly journey through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, spotlighting the music and the hidden gems that shaped the soundtrack of our lives. From the powerful beats to the soulful melodies, we bring you the best of the past with fresh insights and stories. Rediscover the music that defined a generation. Subscribe to the Rap Soul Podcast and enjoy the vibes.
And just like that, we're back. Breaking it down today. Beats, Rhymes, Life, the fourth LP from A Tribe Called Quest. 1996, July 30th, 1996. This album is 20 years old. And if you're anything like me, knowing that this album is 20 years old, it makes you feel old. But that's beside the point. All right, so here's my thoughts on this album. I think, first and foremost, we have to be honest with ourselves. This actually is a pretty good album. That being said, this album was a letdown. If and I know what I said, it sounds like an oxymoron, but it is. This was a very good album, but this album was a letdown, particularly for Tribe Called Quest fans. Now, I will say this, that the critics love this album. A Tribe Called Quest fans, not as much. I think most Tribe Called Quest fans like me, we like this album. We like certain parts about this album. We will listen to this album, but I think the thing that we have to understand about this album is that it's not like the other albums. And I think that's the thing. Personally, for me, that's what bothers me, because People's Instinctive had a certain feel, a certain flow that kind of set the tempo. Low End Theory stayed on that same tempo, but then kind of went to the next level. Same for Midnight Marauders. I thought that it was on the same flow, on the same path as far as Tribe was concerned, but just at another level. And, this album was the fall off. Here's what I like. Sonically, I love this album. I think the Umma group, Q-Tip, Ali Shaheed Muhammad, and the great Jay Dilla, the GOAT. I thought they did an incredible job with these beats, man. I loved it. There's not one beat on this album that I'm like, okay. I can do without. Nah, it wasn't that, man. It was just, I think this album, sonically, I think it sounds good. I think it sounds great. Is it as dope as the previous three sonically? No, it's not, but I think it's very good. And that's saying a lot, because you have to remember the three previous albums are heralded by in a lot of hip hop circles as classics. So that's like winning the Super Bowl 3 consecutive years. And the fourth year, you not only not make the playoffs, but you go, 4-12. I mean, so it was, or you go 8-8 and you win your first 8 games and then you lose your last 8 games. I don't know. It was just, it was a fall off. And again, I don't think that takes anything away from the production. The production is what I actually liked. Lyrically, this album isn't up to par. I don't think that, and I was glad to see the documentary, as I mentioned, from Michael Rappaport, Beats, Rhymes, Life, because there was a lot of internal strife going on within the group. And that documentary, kind of showed it. And even after watching it a couple of times, I still don't know how or where it came from. I mean, some people say, well, Tip is an asshole. Some people said Fife was tripping. Ali Shaheed was definitely in the middle. I mean, I don't really know how much more he could have done. But, this album was definitely a curveball to its fans. I mean, they didn't really have the samples, like how the previous album did. Previous 3 albums did, heavy samples, like I said, a jazzy type sound. Umma didn't necessarily, I don't know, and it may have been their growth as producers. I don't know. This album, really featured a lot of R&B sound. Like I said, the Once Again, Stressed Out. I mean, those are the 2 biggest singles off the album. And it's, some would say, and I've heard Tribe fans say this, is that, they were swinging for the charts. And they made the charts. I mean, this album went to number 1. So, I don't know if that's if that's what their goal was per se, but if that's what the goal was, then they hit it. One thing that I didn't like about the album, I'm gonna be honest, and I've heard a lot of people say this, was Consequence. And it's not that Consequence is a bad MC, because he's actually a pretty decent MC. Consequence, came out of nowhere really for us as fans on this album. Keep in mind, again, this is 1996, July 30th, 1996. So there was no internet. So there was no way for us to know who this guy was. And, he wasn't like on the mixtape. So he just literally came out of nowhere. And it's almost like, I remember telling my man, I was like, they just threw this dude on the album. Like if I was walking past the studio and it was like, hey, Kyle, get on this album. That's kind of like how it felt. And I know that's not what it is. And it's no diss to Consequence. I just don't think that he fit this album. It may have been a little bit easier to stomach Consequence if he had been on previous albums. It may have been easier to stomach Consequence if he had been on 1 or 2 songs. But his voice is on half the album. And what's even more surprising is that you get a lot of Consequence and we got a lot less Fife. And of course, we know by now at that particular time, Fife had moved from New York to here in Atlanta. And, they were going their separate ways, both individually and collectively. So, it was just, this album was a sign that, things were probably headed downhill from there. But I know most of the Tribe fans that I know, I don't want to say they didn't like this album. They just didn't love it. And I can honestly echo those sentiments. I like this album. I don't love this album. If you give me just the instrumental, I probably could rock to it. But one thing I didn't like was Consequence all over the album. Another thing I didn't like, I don't think that we got our best from Phife and Q-Tip. And I think, Phife just, and the documentary kind of confirmed it, but both Phife and Q-Tip, they seem to kind of just be getting their way through. And I'm not going to say that wasn't their best effort. I think they could have and should have done better. They weren't rhyming the same. Phife wasn't rhyming the same on this joint as he did on Midnight Marauders. You go back and listen to Midnight Marauders, and Phife was killing it. He was killing it. I mean, that's Phife. When you hear that right there, that's Phife. Yeah, man. This album, again, it was good. Source gave it 4 mics. If I had to give it a mic on my mic rating system, I'd probably give it 3.5. 3.5 means it was dope. So it's a dope album. I give it 3.5. It probably, maybe on a good day 4, depending on how I feel. As far as replay value, I still listen to this album from time to time. I listened to it, a couple of times leading up to this show, up to this podcast. And I was quickly reminded of, why I like this album. And then I was also quickly reminded of what I didn't like about the album. And, it's not to say that, A Tribe Called Quest is a bad group, because I love them as a group. That they're in my top 5 of all time when it comes to hip hop groups. But this was the start of the ending for Tribe. And it's unfortunate because I'm such a fan. And I think I remember talking to some of my friends after this album dropped, and I expressed my fandom, if you will, as far as how dope I thought the album was. But looking back on it now, it wasn't as good as I thought it was. And I think that's one of the things that, as hip hop fans, you have to let some time pass when you're listening to an album, and then when you go back to it, a year, 5 years, 10 years later, if it still has that same replay value, and you can understand and feel how and why you fell in love with the album, then that makes sense. It's I think that's key. But other than that, like I said, it's a good album. It's not, and unfortunately for Tribe, they set the bar extremely high. They set the bar extremely high for themselves. So with that being said, I gotta give it 3.5 mics. As far as what they're doing now, obviously Ali Shaheed Muhammad, after they dropped the next album, which was the Love Movement, and the Love Movement, my personal opinion, the Love Movement wasn't a good album either. Again, another album with some dope production. But if you think that they kind of walked it through Beats, Rhymes, and Life, they really mailed it in on on the Love Movement. I thought the production was incredible. I mean, give me the Love Movement instrumental and I'm there. I'm your guy. But yeah, I can only think of 2 tracks on the Love Movement that I actually like. Other than that, they moved on. Obviously, Ali Shaheed Muhammad got with Lucy Pearl. He started doing production. Q-Tip went solo, had his album. Didn't particularly care for his album, but that's another story for another day. And Phife, he had a solo album as well. And what they're doing now, obviously, Ali Shaheed Muhammad, he's still making music, still producing, DJing. Same for Q-Tip. He's still making music. I'm told that there is another Q-Tip album in the works. Hopefully we'll get it. I don't know. I don't know how people necessarily receive, particularly, I don't know how Tribe fans receive Q-Tip's solo efforts. Some receive it well. Personally, I would prefer to see Q-Tip rhyming with the group, but hey, it is what it is. Would I support it? Of course I would, because I'm a fan. But So he's still working on music. Still, he, from what I understand, has an album that should be out by the end of this calendar year. And then there's Phife. Unfortunately, he passed away on March 22nd, 2016, at the age of 45. Man, and I'll be honest, Phife's death rocked us all, rocked the hip hop community, because we didn't see it coming. I mean, the Funky Diabetic, the 5 foot, or whatever you want to call Phife, man. I love Phife, man. And he is definitely being missed. His enthusiasm, his knowledge, what he brought to the table as far as the group was concerned. And again, when I watched the documentary Beats, Rhymes, and Life, it's kind of bittersweet, man, because even back then you knew that we weren't getting another Tribe album, and now we were almost assured that unless they have some music in the archives, we're not going to ever get another Tribe album, and that's unfortunate. But I will say this much: if you want to appreciate Tribe in its essence and in its heyday, you definitely want to listen to the 3 albums. As for Beats, Rhymes, and Life, again, if you have not listened to it, if you haven't listened to it in a while, pick it up. I could be wrong. Again, I think it's a solid album, not great, especially in the grand scheme of things when you compare the other albums of 1996. We've got quite a few more to cover. But July 30th, 1996, a solid effort by A Tribe Called Quest. Not their best effort, but a good album nonetheless. Take a listen. Let me know what you think. Thanks again for checking out another edition of the 12 Kyle podcast. I'm your boy 12 Kyle. I'll holler at you next time. 5,000.
Thank you for listening. This concludes the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the Rap Soul podcast. You can find the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Follow the podcast on social media. And feel free to continue this discussion on our Reddit page. More importantly, share this podcast with a friend or family member who loves music as much as you do. Until next time, 5,000.